Welcome back to #Fempire. Today's episode is one I hope every leader, senior decision maker, or anyone really listens to closely. Because we're talking about power dynamics and the imbalances that disproportionately impact women across workplaces and sectors. Joining me once again is LeClair, founder of Uprising Consulting, to unpack the critical issues surrounding power, accountability, and the misuse of non-disclosure agreements. From NDAs used to silence survivors, to the systematic failures of institutions meant to protect them, Liz brings clarity, compassion, and insight to one of the most pressing challenges in our workplaces and society today. We talk about boundary-spanning roles, the unspoken costs of silence, and why accountability and justice, not just policy, must be at the center of any organization that claims to care about equity. This episode is raw, real, and deeply personal. But more than anything, it's a call to action for leaders to step up, for survivors to be truly heard and not persecuted, for apologies to be made, and for us to create communities and workplaces where justice is non-negotiable. A quick heads up, this episode contains discussions of workplace harassment, bullying, and sexual harassment, including personal experiences. Listener discretion is advised. Please take care while listening. This isn't just a conversation, it's a call to action. So let's get into it. I want to dive into how fundraising can be incredibly rewarding, but also comes with that very real and often unspoken power imbalance. There's money on the line, high-profile events in the mix, often a landscape dominated by men in senior, high-ranking roles. And that dynamic becomes even more complicated when predominantly young women fundraisers are expected to build a relationship with these male donors. This transaction of fundraising inherently has that power dynamic embedded in it. So from your experience, what challenges does that create, and how can women coming in this field, any advice you could share to recognize these power dynamics?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's just fundraising, you know? So I was the chair of the Association of Fundraising Professionals Women's Impact Initiative in 2021, I think. And one of the things that we did was work on a survey with Ohio State University researchers around workplace safety and kind of the dynamics. And one of the things that those researchers taught me was this idea of a boundary spanning role. And boundary spanning is any position where you are a conduit between your organization or cause or whatever it is, your product, and the customer or the public. And so boundary spanning roles include things like social workers, nurses, doctors, paramedics, waiters, servers at restaurants, airline attendants, all kinds of things. Harassment, abuse, and power dynamics exist. The statistics around harassment are almost identical in all of those sectors. Because there exists a power dynamic between the customer, whoever it is, with wealth, power, or privilege, and an individual who's being paid probably minimum wage or some kind of really crappy salary, and their entire livelihood is dependent on their ability to either appease that individual or to make sure that they're happy or whatever. So no wonder these things happen, right? I mean, disproportionately, there's like largely most people we come into contact with, they don't harass us, they don't abuse us. But when we do interact with it, one of the things I've often talked about with people is you're never going to stop all of these bad things happening in the workplace. What you can do is change how you respond to them. And I think that's what organizations are doing so badly. But the power dynamics are inherently always going to exist. We are never going to be able to get rid of that. But you can empower your employees to know that they can say no and they can report and that they will be believed and that there will be a trauma-informed response to how they disclose. And they won't be asked to sign an NDA or some confidentiality agreement where their compensation for harm done is contingent on their silence. And you will apologize wholeheartedly with your full chest, and you will then focus on, how do I do better by the rest of my employees to ensure that this doesn't happen again? That's the piece that's missing. We can never get rid of the power dynamics. Those will always exist. And I also think it takes the onus off the person who's disclosing, right? Because I think the thing that often gets talked about is, like, when I remember when Me Too kind of first blew up, everyone was like, okay, well, how do we tell people they can say no? And these women should not put themselves in these situations. Well, no, that's never going to happen. Again, the focus is on the wrong person, as we often tend to do. There was no conversations around, what are we doing to ensure that our donors know, our customers know, our clients know that the safety of our staff is paramount and that we will do anything we need to ensure that they are taken care of. Why wasn't that the conversation? And so when I talk with organizations or individuals about it, I always say there is nothing more that any one person can do as a victim or a survivor. It is imperative that these organizations and systems stop fighting survivors and fighting the people who come forward and disclose to be accountable. And I think Anika talks a lot about what the elements of an apology are, is that you acknowledge the harm that's happened. You spend time really thinking about, you really admit to the issue that's at hand. You commit to changing your behavior and that people see that change. Otherwise, apologies are useless. And I think that's what organizations do really badly. So I think if any of your listeners are listening to this and they are themselves victims or survivors of harassment, abuse of any form, for them to know that this was never their fault. The power dynamics were always going to be skewed. And if they were failed by their institutions, again, that's not on them. That's the organizations. It's taken me a decade to get over. And I still, even now, like, I sit there and sometimes think, "Eh, was it my own fault for doing the things that I did?" We'll always ask ourselves that question. But to know that, I think that you referenced it in some of the notes as well about Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton. Monica Lewinsky now is in her 50s, and she's looking back on what happened in her life. And even up until this point, she still kind of held this belief that she was in love with him and that he loved her. And therefore, that somehow made it okay. Not okay, but like that it was a mutually. She's now reflecting on it, saying, during Me Too, she reflected on the fact that she's like, I now look at myself being the same age as the man that I had this affair with. It's not okay. Not to mention he was the most powerful man on the planet with the most powerful political position in the world. What man in his 50s is, this is the way that patriarchy is so toxic, is that men in these powerful positions, and sometimes women, think this gives them carte blanche to treat anyone the way they want. With no thought to the damage we're doing. I cannot imagine. I'm 45. I cannot imagine having an affair with someone who's younger than my stepsons. Like, that would be the age difference. It's just appalling. We ask the wrong questions all the time. We're always asking the wrong questions. We ask, what were you wearing? Why didn't you do this? We never ask, what was he thinking? Why on earth would he think this was okay? This is wrong, you know? And I think that's part of the second generation, the second wave feminists that I find really appalling, is that they still perpetuate that same narrative because they themselves have been stuck in it. It's like, well, I managed to get up the ladder without being harassed, or if I did, I just didn't make a big deal out of it. I had a group of fundraising consultants about 5, 6 years ago on Twitter make this big long thing about how I used my trauma as a shield. And one of them actually said, well, my daughter had the same thing happen, but she doesn't do what Liz does, and she doesn't spend all her time talking about it. And I just thought, wow, you're so trapped. Like, you think you're hurting me, but all you're showing is how trapped you are. You're so trapped in this. We're steeping in it all the time. Patriarchy is everywhere and misogyny is everywhere. And it's easy for us to forget, you know? I have 2 teenage stepsons. They're 15 and 17, and they walk through the world so differently than I ever did. The expectations on them are completely different. And they live in a feminist household. But they walk out the door and I do not worry about what the world's gonna look like for them. Not even a bit. Gender and sex do matter still, and, it is weaponized against us all the time as women, and it's not fair, and it needs to be talked about more.
They're very important conversations, and that's why I have this podcast. I wanna have these conversations. I want this to, bring in men who are allies and wanna understand what their wives, what their mothers, what their daughters, sisters, whatever it is, can experience because it's sometimes when I talk about I've traveled solo a lot, and talking about to some of my friends who are guys also solo traveling, very different experiences. I can't go out and walk the streets between 10 and midnight in a foreign country by myself. The conversations my mom had to have with me as I was going through puberty. And it was no fault on my own, but it was just the understanding of the world around us and what happens to your body is not always, unfortunately, your choice because things will happen to you. Bad things happen. People slip things in your drink. People will attack you. Like there's a magnitude of issues. And yeah, it comes back to that conversation. How can we raise a generation that's not normalizing this? Another two cases that come to mind is there was a judge in Alberta who told a 19-year-old sexual assault victim why she just couldn't keep her knees closed. And these are very real things. Again, whether it happens to you directly or not, these are things that are happening in society. We're seeing it. And you mentioned it in our prep call, but like the bro-oligarchy and what Trump is doing to the manosphere. And there's just so many elements to it. But I want to go back to as we're talking about institutions and how they're not set up to protect us, especially as women. But PEI did something fairly notable. One of the first provinces to pass legislation restricting the misuse of NDAs. Can other jurisdictions learn from that? And how close can we get, do you think, to a national standard with PEI taking a stance on this?
So my husband's family is from Prince Edward Island, and I love them to pieces, but I honestly it's shocking that I mean, you're talking about the same island, the same province, and up until literally not all that long ago, you were not allowed to have an abortion there. So, it's not the most progressive place, and they will admit that. There's certain values, very much a certain way of living and a certain way of life, which they're very proud of, and they should be, but there's pros and cons to it. So it was shocking to me that they were the first ones, and that's actually how I got connected to this campaign is I heard Dr. Julie McFarlane and the rep from PEI talking about the fact that they had gotten this bill passed. It was phenomenal. Unfortunately, it's been 4 years and no one else in Canada's passed the legislation, and there's been a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of like, "Well, we're gonna take choice away from victims. What if they want an NDA?" Okay, well, let's play that out. So there are such things as a one-sided confidentiality agreement. So that individual can sign it saying that you cannot disclose who I am and my details, but I am allowed to talk to a therapist or to my family or whoever about what's happened. Then another argument's been made and it continues to happen is that, well, it'll impact the amount of settlement that people receive because companies want to be assured of their reputational damage, what will happen. Again, whistleblowing is incredibly rare and very, very rare, and most of the people who are whistleblowers were forced to do it because the organizations were not properly dealing with the issue, so maybe we talk about less about that and more about how you fix your internal reporting systems. And then the final thing is that, there's a lot of people that say, "Well, if we do this, then we're gonna take choice away from people, it's how they choose to go forward." And also too, will it impact businesses as a whole? We're very clear that the legislation it does not stop people using NDAs. It stops people using NDAs for the purposes of covering up abuse in the workplace. That has to be a very important distinction. The other is that if settlements are tied to silence, are they really about the victim? I would argue no. Majority of people just wanna go and live their life and get healing and talk to a therapist, but we know that these are covering up illegal activities. We know that it's covering up crimes, assaults. People aren't able to report to regulators. I just don't understand. I think when you talk about whether this is possible, I do think that we are far enough out from Me Too. People have forgotten, much like they have with Black Lives Matter and George Floyd's murder and all of these things. Humans are so prone to forgetting. And I think PEI struck while the iron was hot, and the rest of them have left it to sort of just die out and hope that it goes away. I just think they forget who they're dealing with because, I mean, we've been doing this for a long time now. I've been out there banging the drums about this for the last decade. I'm not going anywhere. So it's not going to get quieter. And I think that we have to stop talking about what organizations and perpetrators deserve and talk more about what victims and survivors deserve. And stop using this language that, again, is just perpetuating more paternalism, misogyny. Well, why wouldn't a victim be able to make a safe choice? You're acting like we're children. We're not children, you know? Anyhow, I don't know if that really answers your question, but my hope is that we'll see legislative change sometime soon. But I don't hold out hope with Trump and everything that's happening south of the border. It's easy for people to deflect right now. Distraction is a really great way to deflect from the real core issues, right? So, but we have a new prime minister and a new cabinet coming in, and my hope is that we can work towards all of the recommendations from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Truth and Reconciliation, the Mass Casualty Commission that happened here in Nova Scotia. They all have the same recommendations, and silencing is a big part of all of them. So, yeah.
Yeah. And as we're just wrapping up here, I- I'm reflecting on that point about we need to make this more victim focused and not about protecting the institution that perpetuates these harms or the people involved. Why do you think that is? Do you think that they choose to uphold those institutions to avoid that accountability piece? Like, what do you think is the fear with the accountability? Maybe even, I know money is like the huge factor, right? Because once you admit to it, you have to pay to it. I'm putting like air quotes because nothing can ever, there's no financial compensation for the harm, physical and mental, that has been done to an individual. But if we took out that financial component, what does accountability mean to those institutions, do you think?
Well, have you ever had to make a really public apology to someone that you've hurt?
I haven't.
I have a couple of times when I have caused harm, and it sucks. It hurts. It feels awful in the moment. When you realize that you've done something bad, and human nature is to be defensive. I'm not that person. And to sit in it is extremely painful. To sit in the fact that you have caused harm or that you're responsible for the harm caused is also extremely painful. We have to remember at the core of this, of governments, organizations, whatever it is that we're talking about, institutions, are people. And people don't like to be seen as bad. To then offer a full-throated apology, you're publicly stating that you have fucked up and that you've done irreparable harm and that you're going to try better. And then the other thing that happens is if you don't get it right and you don't fix things in a timeline, people want to see it happen quickly. And we don't give people space to apologize and then work through things. Restorative justice is a very difficult, long process, and it can be painful. And a lot of people get very defensive. I don't think that our leadership in Canada, our leaders globally, people in leadership, whatever sector it is, I don't think they've been conditioned to have humility because that is not in a capitalist society which makes you successful. You have to be bold, you have to be brave, you have to make decisions, you have to be ready to whatever. And they tell you, you have to be prepared to get it wrong. But no one ever teaches leaders about humility and the power of an apology and about the power of restitution and restorative work. And I think that that should be at the crux of all business schools and leadership. Being humble can go a long way in developing and retaining good staff and creating a culture of really solid organizational trust. It is the one thing that I think is sorely lacking. Um, organisms react to attacks in the way that they shut down and they just, I think of like a potato bug. You kind of hit it, it curls up in a ball and kind of rolls away. And to me, that's part of the problem. I think at the end of the day, we have to remember we're all human, but an apology can go a long way in helping someone heal. A long way. And I think also too, lawyers in the law have made apologies, turn them into something that then people think is automatically going to turn into a lawsuit. And I think people need to know that saying you're sorry this has happened does not mean that you are responsible for all the harm, but it could go a long way in someone feeling like they're understood. I've never in all my years ever received an apology from, not a real one, from any of these people. It would have gone a long way to help me heal. A long way. Forgiveness is much easier to do when you think the person on the receiving end really means it. And the one time I received an apology from one of the leaders, he wrote it on like sent me an email. It was on letterhead, and at the top of it said, I can't remember what the wording is, what lawyers use to say, like, I'm saying this, but it's not me admitting to guilt. And I wrote him back. I said, if you're going to write me an apology, write me an apology. This means nothing. This is nothing to me. So say you're sorry, mean it, and then work to be better and not replicate the same harms you've caused. This is all we can do as humans. And I think that PR firms and lawyers and management consultants have a propensity to not give good advice, to be honest with you. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think we can only do what we can do is model and practice it in our lives and then hope that that permeates out into the rest of the world, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you hit a lot of really good points. And I'm reading a book now as well called Moral Ambition. And the author talks about all of this energy and resources and money that we put into consulting and lawyers to defend bad behavior. Imagine what they could do if they were actually upholding and doing good. So I take your point on that.
And people chase the money, right? Yeah, I agree. There's also a really great book called What It Takes to Heal by Prentice Temple. Prentice Temple is a non-binary, like a queer Black person that lives in the US, and they're a therapist and they work in radical spaces and spaces where there's a lot of protest. And they have this beautiful quote which says, boundaries are the distance by which I can love you and myself simultaneously. And so I think for those of us that are survivors, we have to choose that space, that boundary, right? We build our lives in distance from the places that have harmed us, not because we want to be able to like exclude them or whatever it's, but we're holding them at a distance because that's the only way that we can truly know that we love ourselves and take care of ourselves. And what organizations are doing in creating this distance between us and them is isolating a lot of really potentially wonderful employees and contributors. But we are also creating our own spaces, and you're finding yours. I have a community. You're building your community. I have faith in community building being the antidote to this problem. And I think that what you're doing with this podcast is a really great example of that. And you find healing in finding others who understand your experience, right? And I think the biggest thing is to know that regardless of what others have done to us, that we are loved and we are cared for, because people take that away from you. It's hard to build it back, but the thing that's helped me heal the most has been time and community. So, yeah.
That was beautifully said. I'm getting teary-eyed already.
I'm not gonna pull an Esther and talk about my mom and start crying, but I can recognize in others somebody that's been deeply wounded and lost trust and faith, and it's hard. It's really hard. So just know that it's a journey. It takes time, and we're all working towards something better. That's all we can do, right? So, and you're brilliant. This podcast is brilliant. I've heard your interviews. You're fabulous. So keep at it. I'm really impressed.
Thank you, Liz. That means a lot. And yeah, I think to your point, I think part of the healing is time. And I was reflecting on this as well. Like, why did I start these podcasts? And to me, I didn't realize it, but I think I had felt voiceless for a long time. And this is really giving me a power and a healing journey, and to be able to bring people into this community space. Like, community is huge. I grew up in it, and being able to make my own community in a different way is, I think, so much more meaningful, and I want to keep giving back. So on that note, this was such a powerful conversation.
This was a really enjoyable experience, and thank you for the time, and let's just keep having the conversation because I think, I'm excited to see what the future holds for you. You're gonna do amazing things. So,
Thank
yeah.
you. That means a lot. That was LeClair, founder of Uprising Consulting and doing some amazing advocacy work. Any other closing thoughts?
Oh, I mean, I think my biggest thing is that a lot of people write to me and say, like, I don't feel safe or brave enough to be able to do what you do. No one has to replicate my journey or your journey. I think to find your own way, to find the things that you can change in your life. Esther did this great presentation at the conference around 15%. What's the 15% that you can achieve in your life that doesn't require anyone to sign off on, doesn't require any more money, and that you can do? And I think that applies to life as well as work. And what is the 15%? So I would just encourage people to think about that. What are the little things that you can do every day? And as we're experiencing attacks on the ideas of equity, justice, and inclusion, I think it's more important to lean into those values, right? So don't be afraid to stand up for them because they're important and nothing to be ashamed of at all. And the rest is just people have to figure out their own way. So, yeah.
Yeah, everybody has their journey, and that was some really powerful stuff. So again, Liz, thank you so much for your kind words, for your vulnerability and sharing your story, and raising awareness about these really important issues that are going on in society. So that was Liz LeClair, founder of Uprising Consulting, on #Fempire. Make sure to tune in next week for my next special guest as we continue to fight the patriarchy one podcast episode at a time.